The terminal air was heavy with the aroma of freshly ground coffee, the sound of people talking, and the soft beep of scanning boarding passes. At Gate 47, the shiny silver plane waited, gleaming and strong, ready to take its travelers across the nation. Among them was a man whose history, unknown to all, was soon to become the rhythm of the flight. His name was Malcolm Carter, a tall, dignified black man in his early 40s. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man who had worked tirelessly for every inch of respect he had gained. His navy blue suit was perfectly cut, his tie understated yet authoritative. To anyone who observed, he appeared a man of means, a man who was used to being in the front of the plane. Yet, to many in that airport, he was just another black man in a world that all too often judged before it listened. Malcolm was not any ordinary traveler. He was the head of one of the fastest rising technology firms in America, a company that had broken ceilings and remade what black leadership in Silicon Valley was. He had built his empire from the ground up, spending sleepless nights and years' worth of doubts from individuals who didn't believe someone who looked like him could be in charge in boardrooms where faces like his were not common. The first-class ticket in his pocket wasn't free. It wasn't offered as a gesture. It was the result of decades of determination, grit, and the refusal to acquiesce to a world that told him to remain in the back seat. As he moved towards the counter, the gate agent smiled woodenly. "Evening, sir. Boarding pass, please." Malcolm presented it with a nod, anticipating the customary drill. But when her eyes passed over the paper, her smile wavered ever so momentarily, to be replaced by a trace of hesitation. She looked up at him and back at the screen, before looking back at him once again. "Sir," she said cautiously, "I think there's been a mistake." "This seat is reserved." Malcolm's eyebrows shot up. "Reserved? My ticket clearly indicates first class. Seat 2A. The agent shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Standing behind her, a man in a starched pilot's uniform leaned negligently against the counter, observing the encounter with a smirk. His presence was not an accident. He was the flight captain, and from the narrowing in his eyes, it was evident that he had already made up his mind about Malcolm before one word had been said. The agent cleared her throat. "Yes, but the captain has requested that this seat not be assigned to you." The words were poison in the air. Malcolm's jaw clenched. He had experience with veiled slights, coded messages, and policed refusals dressed up in customer service smiles. But this was different. This was not a suggestion. It was a denial. A denial based not on policy, not on mistake, but on prejudice. He spoke quietly, control, as he had learned to when all his instincts screamed to shout. "You mean to tell me that I am not allowed in the seat I have paid for?" The captain stiffened, advancing a step. His voice had the casual arrogance of a man who was convinced the world was his to command. "That's right. We will put you in business class. It will be more comfortable." The implication burned. More at ease, as if first class was not his place. As if he did not deserve to be there. Other passengers around him shifted awkwardly, sensing the unease but not wanting to interfere. Some looked away, acting like they had not heard. Others observed with interest, their faces revealing mental judgments of their own. Malcolm breathed, regulating himself. "I paid for first class. I will sit in first class." The captain's smirk grew. "Not on my plane, you won't." It was a conflict of worlds. A man who thought his uniform gave him absolute power, and another who knew his value wasn't for sale. But Malcolm had something the captain didn't. Power is multifaceted, and not all of it has stripes on its back. With intentional calm, Malcolm moved aside, letting the line of passengers continue to board. He didn't yell, didn't protest, didn't plead. He just watched, his mind already calculating the math of justice. He had learned a long time ago that occasionally the greatest retort to disrespect is patience, not quiet, but strategy. He came aboard last, ushered brusquely into a business class seat. The flight attendant was not looking at him, her smile being forced, as if she too realized the atrocity happening but lacked the strength to resist her captain. Malcolm settled, his long body squeezing into the shorter seat, his thoughts seething. The engines rumbled as the aircraft prepared for departure. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, full of the same casual authority he had wielded at the gate. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We'll be pushing back shortly." Malcolm stared out the window, his reflection staring back at him. He had faced worse than this. He had weathered decades of boardrooms full of explications, investors who didn't believe his vision, co-workers who questioned his IQ, and competitors who doubted his ambition. But this wasn't about him. It was about every black traveler who had ever been informed in subtle or overt terms that they didn't belong in some places. It was about dignity. It was about justice. And with the minutes ticking away, as the cabin door shut and the plane started to roll, Malcolm had one certainty locked in his mind. This flight was not taking off on those conditions. Not today. Never. The cabin lights flickered dim as the plane moved away from the gate. Passengers strapped in, shoving headphones back over ears, opening laptops or shutting their eyes to the hours to come. But Malcolm settled nothing. His chest expanded and contracted in controlled breaths, the beat of a man maintaining his dignity as every nerve within him shrieked at the injustice he had just experienced. The seatbelt alarm beeped. A flight attendant strode down the aisle, double-checking latches and overhead compartments. Her expression was courteous, but her eyes revealed the tension she bore. She paused for an instant at Malcolm's aisle, her voice subdued, as if she wished to keep her distance from what occurred but couldn't. "Sir, if there is anything I can do to make you more comfortable," she murmured. Malcolm gazed up at her, his eyes unyielding. "What you can do," he answered, "is tell me one thing. Why was I not given the seat I had paid for?" The attendant hesitated, looking nervously down the length of the plane toward the cockpit door. "That choice wasn't mine, I realize," Malcolm stated calmly. "But tell me, did you notice anything amiss with it?" Her mouth opened, then closed. For an instant, the silence between them spoke volumes more than words ever had. She gave a tiny, almost sorry nod before she passed by. Malcolm relaxed into himself, his bitterness in his throat slicing acutely now. It wasn't the denial, it was the acquiescence. The somber acceptance of those who viewed wrong but valued safety over defiance. He saw this done before, in boardrooms, in deals, in society itself. Injustice did not survive by force alone. It thrived in silence. From a few rows ahead, a passenger turned around. He was a middle-aged white man in a polo shirt, his expression irritated. "Hey!" the man whispered harshly. "You're making a scene! Just take the seat and let's get on with the flight. Some of us have connections to make." Malcolm's lips twisted into a small, incredulous smile. "A scene?" he whispered. "What you just saw wasn't a scene. It was a choice. A choice to withhold from me what I've worked for because of the way I look. If that bothers you, perhaps it should." The man snorted and turned back around, grumbling under his breath. Malcolm rummaged in his carry-on bag and extracted his phone. His fingers moved with precise calm as he wrote an email. Not to a friend, not to a lawyer, but to his corporate headquarters. He knew precisely what levers to push, exactly which strings pulled which powers. The world had evolved. Technology had provided him with reach far beyond the envelope of seat 14B. And as the plane started down the runway, Malcolm sent. The plane took off into the air, engines thundering. But within Malcolm there was another engine thundering more loudly, the engine of determination. He shut his eyes for a moment, remembering what he had always remembered his grandmother telling him when he was a boy growing up in Georgia. "Son, dignity is not something anyone can give you. But don't you ever let anyone take it away." The ascent evened out, and the seatbelt indicator beeped again. Malcolm opened his phone again. In minutes, responses started trickling in. His executive assistant, taken aback by the alarm in his email. His operations chief, already drawing out flight information. His firm's lawyers putting wheels into action. Malcolm hadn't constructed his firm by sitting silently while doors were shut in his face. He had constructed it kicking down those doors and, if necessary, grounding planes. Back in the cockpit, the captain leaned back comfortably, his tone low as he addressed the co-pilot. "Problem solved," he said complacently. "Didn't want him up here with the rest of us. People should be kept in their place." The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, his fingers clenching on the controls. He didn't answer. Some truths were too hazardous to speak. Back in the cabin, Malcolm's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't his staff. It was the chairman of the AIRLINE's board of directors, a man who also happened to sit on the advisory panel of Malcolm's company. The message was brief but powerful. "I've been informed. This will not stand. I'm making calls." Malcolm permitted himself a heavy sigh. The irony was biting. The pilot who had attempted to demote him to a lower seat did not know that the man he scorned had power reaching into the very center of his employer's command. It was as if the universe had staged this showdown not as shame, but as enlightenment. The minutes ticked by. A flight attendant set down a beverage, placing it on Malcolm's tray table with tentative hands. "Compliments of the crew," she whispered, her voice laced with something akin to guilt. Malcolm thanked her, but his gaze never left hers. His mind was already racing ahead, charting the encounter that was about to take place. It wasn't vengeance. It was principle. A matter of demonstrating that when dignity was once stomped on, it has a way of coming back even more powerful than before. 2 hours into the flight, when the cabin had settled into silence, Malcolm's phone buzzed again. This time it was a direct call. He picked it up quietly, his voice very low. "Mr. Carter," said the authoritative voice on the other line. "We've gone over it." The pilot exceeded his authority. "You're in command here. Do you want us to move now or at landing?" Malcolm's eyes shifted toward the door to the cockpit. The engines thrummed in the silence. He remembered the captain's condescending smile, the patronizing tone, the assumption that he must have the last say. "No," Malcolm answered bluntly. "We act now." The voice on the other end did not falter. "Understood." 5 minutes had passed when the intercom squeaked. Passengers awoke, looking up as the captain's voice came through the cabin. But it wasn't the confident voice they had heard before. It was short, hesitant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received word of a working situation. We will have to turn back to the airport." Gasp filled the air. Rumors spread fast. "Turn back? What went wrong?" "Is there something wrong with the airplane?" Confusion spread like a wave. Malcolm remained motionless, his expression impassive. He knew full well what had occurred. The flight was not turning around due to mechanical problems. It was turning around due to the intervention of justice in the skies. The engines started to throttle back, the nose of the aircraft tilting towards descent. Outdoors, the clouds parted as the airplane banked towards the city lights on the horizon. Indoors, tension grew. The pilot's voice came back, sharp and urgent. "Please stay seated." "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The man in the polo shirt who had reprimanded Malcolm just before looked back over his shoulder, pale-faced. "What's happening?" he asked anxiously. Malcolm met his gaze, his voice calm but weighted with meaning. "What's going on," he said slowly, "is accountability." The plane descended, the ground rushing closer. Passengers exchanged uneasy looks, some whispering prayers, others gripping armrests. But Malcolm sat still, centered, every line of his body radiating quiet power. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't made a scene. And still, with determination, with forbearance, and with a web of influence that extended beyond the captain's wildest dreams, he had already altered the trajectory of this flight, literally and metaphorically. And when the wheels hit the runway, their tires shrieking against the pavement, Malcolm knew the real battle was only just starting. The landing jolted through the cabin, the tires shrieking on the runway before settling into a rolling stop. Travelers exchanged confused glances. Whispers threaded through the aisles like strands of doubt. Some thought there must have been mechanical issues. Others wondered about security risks. But a single man among them was aware of what was going on, and he remained seated quietly in business class, his back straight, his gaze straight ahead. Malcolm Carter did not move, did not squirm. He walked like a man who already knew the conclusion to this tale, even though the other passengers in the plane were eagerly waiting for an explanation. The aircraft taxied to the terminal, but rather than coming up to the gate, it halted short on a distant strip of tarmac. Whispers turned to murmurings. Travelers leaned against their windows, attempting to see what it was. Shortly, flashing lights materialized. 2 black SUVs drove into view, flanked by airport security cars. The air in the cabin tightened. The captain's voice trembled through the intercom, clearly drained of its initial arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen, sit down, please. We, are dealing with a little problem. There is no risk." The deception was thin. The apprehension only grew. The cabin door swung ajar, and in walked 2 men in suits flanked by airport security. They didn't lurch with the frantic strides of emergency responders. No, their step was deliberate, authoritative, unmistakably official. One of the suited men, with silver hair and a voice that bore the authority of command, boomed loudly enough for the cabin to hear. "Captain Reynolds," he barked, his voice biting. "Get out of the cockpit right away." The whole cabin came to a standstill. Travelers looked at the cockpit door as it slowly swung open to reveal the captain. His former superior smirk had soured into bewilderment. "What's this all about?" he barked, attempting to keep his voice steady. The silver-haired captain's face was icy. "This is regarding an act of discrimination and misconduct on your watch. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Gasps filled the cabin. The flight attendants stiffened in shock. The co-pilot, sitting behind, looked away, not wanting to catch his captain's eye. Malcolm didn't budge. He just watched. The captain spluttered, his face growing red. "This is ridiculous! Who do you think you are? You can't just—" The silver-haired man interrupted him with a raised hand. "This is at the behest of the board of directors of the airline. You've shamefaced this company, compromised its reputation, and insulted a passenger who was better than that. You will leave now." The gravity of the situation fell heavily upon the cabin. Passengers who had once regarded Malcolm with condescending interest now came to regard him with eyes that widened in understanding. He was no ordinary man in seat 14B. He was the cause of this standoff. The captain's gaze tracked theirs, coming to rest upon Malcolm. His face contorted with a mask of shock and anger. "You!" he snarled. "This is your fault." Malcolm did shift at last. He rose slowly, his height imposing. He did not shout, but his voice carried in the cabin with irrefutable certainty. "No," Malcolm replied calmly. "This is not my fault. This is your fault. You made a decision, Captain Reynolds. You looked at me, saw the color of my face, and decided I didn't deserve a seat I paid for. You decided to withhold dignity from me due to prejudice. What's unfolding now isn't punishment. It's consequence." The silence was oppressive. All the passengers' eyes were on Malcolm, the validity of his words unquestionable. The captain attempted to sneer, but his voice broke. "Do you know who I am? Do you know how many years I've flown with no problems?" Malcolm's face didn't waver. "Do you know how many years I've lived with problems such as these? The difference is, today, you picked the wrong man to embarrass." The silver-haired man gestured to security. They moved forward on either side of the captain. He fought, shouting now, but it did nothing except in desperation. "This is crazy! I won't be treated like this!" But his objections were of no account. His command had already broken down. With tight grips on his arms, security ushered him down the aisle by passengers who stood in awed silence. Some covered their faces, ashamed of him. Others glanced at Malcolm, their eyes holding a new measure of respect. While the captain was being escorted out, the co-pilot appeared, his complexion pale. He gazed at Malcolm, then hastily dropped his eyes. The silver-haired individual turned to face the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the inconvenience. Your safety and your dignity are our top concerns. This flight will be rerouted a new captain shortly. Please be patient while we finalize the arrangements." The cabin tension eased somewhat, replaced by a hum of chatter. Passengers hushed to each other, their interest now openly pointed in Malcolm's direction. One woman across the aisle leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you someone important?" Malcolm turned to her, his expression calm. "No," he replied. "I'm just someone who refuses to be disrespected." Her eyes softened. She nodded slowly, as though she understood something deeper than his words. A small black boy, several rows ahead, leaned over the back of the seat, wide eyes locked on Malcolm. His mother attempted to yank him back into line, but Malcolm met the boy's eyes and nodded subtly, a wordless understanding that shouted louder than any oratory. To this child, the sight of a black man standing firm, unbowed by racism, would be seared into memory for life. Within minutes, Malcolm's phone was buzzing once more. It was a text message from the chairman himself, handled. "The captain will not fly for us again. Thank you for bringing this to light. We'll issue a public statement by morning." Malcolm read the words, and then he pushed the phone back into his pocket. He didn't grin. He didn't dance. For him, this wasn't a triumph, it was a correction. The balance of justice had shifted. Not all the way, perhaps, but far enough to remind the world that dignity requires respect. As the new captain came aboard and assumed command, the flight attendants glided with increased vigor, their professionalism edged with humility. One came straight to Malcolm, slightly bending at the waist. "Mr. Carter," she spoke quietly, "on behalf of the crew, I would like to apologize for what you went through." Malcolm inclined his head. "I thank you for that, but keep in mind, an apology is worth nothing if it is not preceded by change." She swallowed but nodded. "Yes, sir." The plane finally returned to the gate. Some passengers decided to exit, not wanting to go on after the interruption. Others stayed, sitting in silence thinking about what they had seen. Malcolm remained seated, composed, determined. He was not interested in leaving the flight. Leaving now would be to let the insult of the pilot determine his trip, and Malcolm Carter never let others determine his way. As the engines lined up again for takeoff, the passengers relaxed back into their seats. This time, the cabin was different. There was an unwritten understanding in the air, a shared perception that they had been eyewitnesses to something greater than a delayed flight. Malcolm shut his eyes momentarily, releasing a breath through his nostrils. He wasn't obtuse. He realized that this one gesture would not undo centuries of strife, nor the infinite number of humiliations still being suffered by individuals who resembled him. But he also recognized that moments count, that rising up, even in the cramped quarters of an airplane cabin, had the potential to resonate into something greater. And finally, for the first time since boarding the plane, Malcolm permitted himself to experience it. Not anger, not bitterness, but pride. Pride in standing firm. Pride in proving to the world and to himself that dignity once fought for is a power unshakable. The cabin lights went dark once more as the engines thrummed into action. This time the mood had changed. The smugness that had previously dripped from the captain's tone was no longer present. The substitute pilot, a woman whose eyes were steady and whose tone was calm and assured, spoke to the passengers with professionalism that bore no hint of prejudice. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I am Captain Rhodes, and I will be flying you to your destination tonight. Safety, dignity, and comfort are our concerns. We're ready for takeoff." A ripple of applause broke out across the cabin, subtle but meaningful. Passengers clapped not just for the new captain, but for the shift in energy, for the restoration of fairness, however temporary. Malcolm sat quietly, his arms resting on his lap in a prayer-like pose. He wasn't seeking applause, approval. This moment wasn't about him. It was about what had been revealed to all on board, that pride could be brought down, that wrong could be met with courage, and that silence didn't necessarily get the last word. The aircraft took off again into the air, and as the cabin stabilized, individuals started to try to make sense of what they had just seen. A woman in her middle age stretched across the aisle in Malcolm's direction, speaking softly and with a hint of adoration. "I've been flying for decades," she breathed, "and I have never seen anything like this. The way you reacted. It was strong." Malcolm smiled graciously. "I didn't do it to be powerful," he said softly. "I did it because respect is non-negotiable." She looked at him for a second before nodding back, her eyes shining. Time ticked by as the flight went on and on. Some passengers slept. Others scrolled through their phones, no doubt already writing texts and posts about the amazing thing they had just seen. In row 12, a young black boy still glanced at Malcolm from time to time, his eyes bulging with awe. Malcolm saw and gave a small smile. The boy stood up straight, pride swelling in his chest. To him, Malcolm wasn't merely a businessman or a passenger. He was proof that standing tall did matter, that dignity could enter any room or onto any plane and claim its space. As the cabin quieted, Malcolm reflected. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood in Georgia, to the long talks with his grandmother on the porch. He remembered her stories of men and women who had been denied jobs, homes, education, not because of ability, but because of skin. He remembered her saying, "One day, you'll face your moment, Malcolm. When it comes, don't shrink. Stand." This flight had been that moment, and he had stood. When the plane eventually landed hours later, the landing was smooth, incident-free. But the tension inside had still not dissipated. Passengers exited, some stopping at Malcolm's row. A suited man who had said nothing before hesitated to shake his hand. "Thank you," he said briefly. A woman with tear-filled eyes whispered, "You gave me courage." Even those who did not speak looked his way with recognition, their silence no longer collusion but respectful. Malcolm came off last. At the gate, airline officials were waiting for him, their faces solemn, their demeanor respectful. One approached, his hand extended. "Mr. Carter, personally, we apologize for what you went through. What Captain Reynolds did was wrong. He will never fly for us again." Malcolm took the man's hand, but his face was reserved. "An apology is just the start." Policy is what counts. Culture is what counts. One man going away doesn't fix the issue. But it's a start. The executive nodded, rebuked. We will do better. I assure you of that. Malcolm smiled faintly. Promises are simple. Change is difficult, but I will be observing. He proceeded by them with the same quiet dignity that he had maintained throughout the night. Beyond the terminal, city lights extended along the horizon, aglow like embers in the blackness. A black sedan was waiting to take him to his hotel, but first, Malcolm stopped. He cocked his head back, staring at the night sky. The sound of planes taking off echoed in the distance. He considered the pilot, now out of his command, possibly sitting somewhere in resentful amazement. He considered the passengers who would report to their families, their friends, their co-workers about what they'd witnessed. And he considered the boy whose eyes had glowed with awe. That boy would never forget. That boy had seen a man choose not to bow. The door to the car opened and Malcolm got in. His phone vibrated again. Messages, press inquiries, press statements written by his company's public relations team. By dawn, this tale would ripple far wider than one cabin. It would resonate in boardrooms, newsrooms, living rooms. Some would argue it. Some would ignore it. But others would feel the burden of it, the inescapable fact that dignity is not awarded by uniform or power, but borne by those who will not relinquish it. As the sedan drove off, Malcolm closed his eyes. He did not crave fame or headlines. All that was important was the principle. All that was important was that for 12 minutes of arrogance, a man had lost his job, and for 12 minutes of patience, another man had assured his place in the world with unshakable dignity. Several days later, the airline made a public apology, admitting systemic failures and promising reforms. The commentators discussed it on TV. Social media is filled up with hashtags and fiery arguments. To some, it was a tale of business responsibility. To others, a lesson in the price of bigotry. To Malcolm, it was not. It was a reminder that justice does not always thunder. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes, when persistence meets determination, it falls like the sound of thunder. Malcolm went back to work, his days filled again with meetings, innovation, strategy. But occasionally, when his mind strayed, he remembered that flight. He remembered the speed with which dignity could be stripped away and how forcefully it could be regained. And when doubt inched its way into his head, about the struggle for justice, about progress grinding slow, he recalled the boy's eyes, aglow with pride. That was all it took to remind him that every stand, however small, counted. Because in that cabin at 35,000 feet, he hadn't merely defended his own pride. He had demonstrated to the world and a generation of onlookers that black pride is unmovable, unshakable, untouchable. And once based on the ground, it only gets higher.